Choctaw and Chickasaw joined forces. The Creek War of 181314. The autumn winds of 1813 carried the acrid smell of smoke across southern Alabama, where the embers of Fort Mims still smoldered. 500 settlers and soldiers, men, women, and children, had met their end. In one of the bloodiest massacres in frontier history, the Creek warriors had painted the fort's walls with blood, leaving behind a message that echoed through every settlement: no one was safe. Welcome to Native Legends and History Stories, where we peel back the layers of time to reveal the raw, unvarnished stories that shaped America. If you're ready to discover history as it really happened, subscribe now and join thousands of others who seek the truth behind the legends. In the aftermath of the Fort Mims massacre, fear gripped the southern territories like an iron fist. Over 1,000 settlers had crowded into neighboring stockades Fort Glass and Fort Madison, their faces gaunt with hunger and worry. Colonel Carson, the military commander between the two rivers, knew their supplies wouldn't last forever. With Creek War parties prowling the wilderness between settlements, each day brought new reports of farms burned, livestock stolen, and families torn apart. It was in this atmosphere of mounting desperation that 19-year-old Jeremiah Austell stepped forward. The son of Captain Evan Austell, young Jeremiah had grown up on the frontier, learning its ways as naturally as breathing. He understood what others might not, that sometimes survival meant taking impossible risks. The mission seemed simple on paper: deliver urgent dispatches to General Claiborne at Mount Vernon. But in reality, it meant traversing 40 miles of Creek territory alone, in the dark, where every shadow might hide a warrior's arrow. The path would take him first to Fort Kearny, 13 miles as the crow flies, but far longer by the winding trails a horse could travel. From there, another 24 miles stretched to Mount Vernon, each one potentially his last. As darkness fell, Jeremiah mounted his fleet cavalry horse. The animal was chosen for both speed and endurance, qualities that might mean the difference between life and death. Before dawn, the young courier carried minimal provisions. Weight could slow them down, and speed was their only real defense. He wore moccasins instead of boots, knowing they would better muffle his horse's footfalls on rocky ground. The night wrapped around them like a burial shroud as they set out. Jeremiah guided his mount with the lightest touch, eyes straining against the darkness, ears alert for any sound that didn't belong to the night. Every rustle of leaves could be a Creek scout. Every snapped twig might signal an ambush. The weight of the dispatches in his saddlebag seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. Hours passed in tense silence until they reached the river bottoms near Fort Kearny. Here the darkness played its cruelest trick. Jeremiah found himself completely disoriented, uncertain whether the fort lay upstream or down. In that moment he made a decision that demonstrated the quick thinking that would later mark his military career. He would use the Creek's own tactics against them. Drawing upon years of frontier experience, Jeremiah led out a war whoop that would have done a Creek warrior proud. The sound echoed across the river bottom, cutting through the night air like a knife. For several heartbeats, silence answered him. Then, as if the very night had come alive, 50 dogs erupted in a cacophony of barking, the fort's unwitting sentinels revealing its location. The fort lay just half a mile distant. Jeremiah turned his horse toward the sound, knowing his gamble had paid off, but also aware that if any real Creek warriors were nearby, they now knew exactly where he was. He spurred his mount forward, counting on speed and surprise to carry him safely to the fort's gates. The inhabitants of Fort Kearny were initially alarmed by the war cry, and Jeremiah found himself staring down the barrels of several rifles when he approached. But recognition quickly turned fear to relief, and soon he was welcomed inside. The fort's residents gathered around him, eager for news from Fort Madison, and grateful that the war cry that had roused their dogs came from friendly lips rather than those of Creek warriors. After a warm meal and brief rest, both man and horse had earned it. They weren't allowed to linger long. The mission was only half complete. Under cover of darkness, they were ferried across the Tombigbee River, the cold water, a stark reminder of the perilous journey still ahead. As they emerged on the western bank, Jeremiah took a moment to orient himself before spurring his horse westward. They passed the Sunflower Bend like ghosts in the night, then skirted McIntosh's Bluff as the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. Finally, as morning light crept across the landscape, the walls of Mount Vernon came into view. Jeremiah had done it, covering 40 miles of hostile territory alone in the dark, without losing either his way or his life. When Jeremiah Austell delivered his dispatches to General Claiborne at Mount Vernon, the general's astonishment quickly turned to concern. The idea of a lone 19-year-old courier traversing 40 miles of hostile territory struck him as needlessly reckless. He immediately moved to reprimand Colonel Carson for failing to provide an escort. But young Austell stood his ground with remarkable confidence, explaining that his keen senses rivaled those of the Creek warriors themselves. More companions, he argued, would have only made them a larger target. His survival had depended on stealth, his horse's speed, and his own resourcefulness. The contents of those dispatches would soon spark a crisis at Fort Madison. General Claiborne's response, though intended as a suggestion, was interpreted as an ironclad order: abandon Fort Glass and Madison, retreat west of the Tombigbee to St. Stephen's. This French and Spanish outpost, with its formidable earthworks and embankments, was considered impregnable against Creek attacks. The news hit the 1,000 settlers at Fort Madison like a physical blow. To them, Claiborne's order felt like abandonment. Their crops stood ready for harvest in the fields. Their plantations lay deserted and vulnerable. The Creek warriors were already burning homesteads, driving off cattle, and in a particularly cruel strategy, driving settlers' hogs into the cornfields to fatten them for their own future feasts. The specter of starvation loomed over the community. Faced with this dire situation, 80 determined citizens made a bold decision. Under the leadership of Captains Evan Austell and Samuel Dale, they would stay and defend their homes. Even as 500 of their neighbors departed with Colonel Carson's troops for Fort Stevens. The parting was heavy with emotion. Families split, friendships strained, each group wondering if they would ever see the others alive again. Those who remained didn't waste time on regrets. They immediately set about strengthening their defenses with innovative solutions born of frontier ingenuity. Their most remarkable creation was a lighting system that transformed the fort's vulnerability at night into its greatest strength. They erected a 40-foot pine pole in the fort's center, surrounded by an ingenious scaffolding system with a central hole. This allowed them to raise and lower a platform loaded with earth and burning longleaf pine. This wasn't just any light. The fat, rich pine would cast an intense glow that illuminated a wide circle around the fort's perimeter. Any Creek warrior attempting to approach under cover of darkness would find himself suddenly exposed in a pool of bright light, an easy target for the fort's defenders. The brilliant solution served another crucial purpose. It eliminated the need for exterior guards at night, allowing their limited fighting force to rest and remain concentrated. The technical sophistication of this defense system reflected the settlers' deep understanding of their situation. They knew they couldn't match the Creek warriors in numbers or mobility. So they leveraged their resources and engineering skills to create an impregnable nocturnal defense. The burning pine beacon became both a practical security measure and a symbol of their determination to hold their ground despite overwhelming odds. The defenders of Fort Madison were no ordinary frontiersmen. Years of fire hunting, tracking deer at night by the reflection in their eyes, had honed their marksmanship to lethal precision within the illuminated perimeter. The Fort Mims massacre had taught them a brutal lesson about underestimating their adversaries, and they had no intention of repeating that fatal mistake. The fort's leadership embodied decades of hard-won experience in Indian relations. Captain Austell carried 14 years of wisdom from his time at the Cherokee Agency in Georgia, where he'd worked to bridge the gap between two worlds. His son had been raised among the Cherokees, absorbing their culture and understanding from childhood. But perhaps most notable was Captain Dale, known to the Creeks as Big Sam, a man so respected in frontier lore that Judge Meek would later dub him the Daniel Boone of Alabama. These men commanded respect not through military rank, but through their intimate understanding of frontier life and Native American warfare. They had carved out homesteads in the wilderness with nothing but axes and rifles, establishing farms on the rich bottomlands between Alabama's major waterways. Their knowledge of Creek battle tactics was not learned from military manuals, but from years of direct observation and interaction. To see one of these frontier leaders was to understand their unique position between two worlds. They cut striking figures. In their practical frontier attire, buckskin garments, hunting shirts, leggings, and moccasins, each carried the tools of survival. A long, heavy rifle for accuracy at range, and a substantial knife swinging beside their shot bags. They moved with a distinctive combination of pride and caution, back straight but steps measured. Eyes alert yet seemingly passive, missing nothing while appearing to observe little. These 80 men who chose to remain at Fort Madison represented the finest qualities of frontier leadership when they proposed to defend their families against the Muskogee warriors. It wasn't bravado speaking. It was the quiet confidence of men who understood exactly what they faced. 2 weeks after Colonel Carson's departure, General Claiborne himself witnessed the precarious situation of the settlers caught between the rivers. His response was swift. Colonel Carson and his troops were ordered back to Fort Madison, validating the settlers' stubborn determination to hold their ground. Ostill's midnight ride, while perhaps less celebrated than Paul Revere's famous gallop, had proven far more perilous. Where Revere had ridden through settled Massachusetts in 1775, Ostill had traversed wilderness, crawling with Creek war parties. The young courier's journey had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the defense of the frontier. Daily life at Fort Madison settled into a dangerous routine. Settlers would occasionally risk visits to their abandoned farms, knowing Creek war parties roamed the countryside. They noticed a peculiar pattern in the raiders' behavior. Corn stored in field cribs was invariably burned, while stores kept in cribs near homes remained untouched, a detail that spoke volumes about the psychological warfare at play. On September 6th, this pattern of risk and consequence would be tested again. Josiah Fisher, a man who straddled both worlds through his marriage to a Creek woman, left the fort with his 3 sons to visit their farm. Located just a quarter-mile above Sizemore's Ferry on the Alabama River, their destination lay in territory where the line between friend and foe had become terrifyingly blurred. As evening approached, Ben Fisher worked in the yard, absorbed in the routine task of shelling peas. Without warning, a shot rang out. The bullet struck him in the back with devastating force. The sound of the shot mixed with cries of pain as Ben, through sheer force of will, managed to push himself up and flee into the dense woods nearby. Hearing the commotion, the elder Fisher emerged from the cane brake where he had been working. Moving cautiously in a stooped position to investigate the source of gunfire, he presented a clear target. A second shot cracked through the air. The bullet tore through Fisher's chest, exiting through his back in a spray of blood. As he turned to escape into the forest, a warrior's voice called out in Muskogee, the tribal language Fisher knew well from his years of marriage into the Creek community. That is the way to do it. The unseen attacker taunted, adding psychological warfare to physical injury. The 2 remaining Fisher sons, scattered in different sections of their field, heard the shots and their brother's cries. They immediately abandoned their work and raced back to Fort Madison, carrying the grave news that their father and brother had surely perished in the attack. Dawn brought the first ray of hope when Ben Fisher staggered into the fort, his wounds still bleeding, but his spirit unbroken. The following afternoon, guards stationed outside the fort's walls spotted movement on the ridge road. A lone figure approached slowly, hunched over in what appeared to be intense pain. As the distance closed, amazed onlookers recognized Josiah Fisher, who had somehow survived his grievous wounds. Drury Allen, among those who went out to meet him, assessed Fisher's injuries with frontier directness. "Fisher," he declared, "I do not wish to discourage you, but you will die of that wound." Fisher's response revealed the stubborn determination that had kept him alive through the long journey back. "Know if it was going to kill me, I would have died before now." Fisher explained his painfully slow return to safety. Every time he tried to move quickly or stand straight, blood would flow so heavily from his wound that he nearly choked on it. This forced him to travel at an agonizing pace, maintaining a stooped position throughout the journey. Though he survived this ordeal, fate had not finished with Josiah Fisher. 2 or 3 years after the war's end, during a corn-shucking gathering at his home, he engaged in what should have been harmless roughhousing with fellow workers. The physical strain proved too much for his old wound. A blood vessel ruptured and Fisher collapsed, dying instantly from the hemorrhage. The month held more dangers for the Fort Madison community. Moses Savell's mill, situated on a small tributary of Bassett's known Creek, as Savell's Branch, needed grain ground. A detail of 12 men was dispatched from the fort for this essential task. As afternoon waned and their work concluded, the group prepared to return. They left behind Phil Craig, a slave tasked with securing the mill, expecting him to catch up shortly on their return journey. When the party reached Fort Madison without Craig, concern grew. 5 days passed before he reappeared, bringing an extraordinary tale of captivity and escape. While finishing his work at the Mill Creek, warriors had surprised and overwhelmed him. They forced him to march along the Alabama River, traveling several miles below Lower Peachtree, where they had concealed a canoe. Using this craft, they crossed to their camp on the opposite bank, where Krieg discovered entire Creek families living away from their traditional territories. The treatment of slaves by Creek warriors differed significantly from their handling of white captives. Instead of facing execution, captured slaves were typically integrated into tribal life as servants, a practice well understood by enslaved people throughout the frontier. During his 4 days of captivity, Krieg experienced this firsthand. His captors fed him well, providing generous portions of venison and honey, the latter carefully preserved in traditional deerskin containers. Showing remarkable strategic thinking, Krieg gave no indication of resistance or displeasure. He appeared to accept his new situation completely, successfully deceiving his captors. With this performance, the warriors grew so confident in his apparent contentment that they left him in camp with their families during their daily hunting expeditions. Each morning the men would depart, never suspecting that their seemingly docile captive was carefully observing their routine and planning his moment to strike. After 4 days of observing the warriors' routines, Phil struck on the morning of the 5th day. He waited exactly 30 minutes after the hunting party departed, slipped silently to the riverbank, and seized their hidden canoe. His paddle strokes were swift and steady across the water, but as he reached the opposite shore, shouts erupted from the camp. The women had spotted him. Their alarm calls carried far enough to reach any hunters still within range. Phil abandoned the canoe and ran, knowing the warriors would soon be on his trail. He found a ridge path and pushed himself along it until his legs could carry him no further. Moving 50 yards off the trail, he concealed himself behind a fallen log. Within an hour, 4 Creek warriors rushed past. Following his tracks on the path, they continued forward, unaware their quarry lay hidden nearby. Phil remained motionless for another hour until he saw the same warriors returning, their pursuit abandoned. Only after they vanished completely did he resume his journey toward Fort Madison, reaching its gates safely at sunset. The fort's brief moment of relief was shattered when Miller hired 16-year-old Ben Arundel to harvest potatoes from his farm, situated 1.5 miles above Suggsville. Multiple residents, including Ben's own father, warned of Creek war parties recently spotted in the area. The teenager dismissed every warning, boldly declaring he was not born to be killed by an Indian. Miller provided his mare for quick travel and armed Ben with a musket and bayonet. Hours passed without the boy's return. His father, consumed by worry, mounted his horse and rode out searching. He returned alone at sunset, having discovered tracks of 2 or 3 Creek warriors leading toward Miller's farm. The crack of a gunshot shortly after confirmed his worst fears, forcing him to retreat to the fort rather than risk the same fate.